Let me tell you about a man who saw a fortune in a pile of firewood, back when everyone else was just trying to keep warm off it. It was the fall of 1959 in the hills outside Mountain View, down in Howell County in the southern part of Missouri. If you have never stood in the Ozarks in late October, you should picture it plainly. The oaks going up the ridges in rust and gold, the mornings cold enough to see your own breath, the smell of wood smoke drifting low across the hollows. And down along a gravel cut off the county road sat a hardwood sawmill, the kind of small mill that a whole hill town leaned on for its living. It cut white oak, mostly, sawn into railroad ties and rough pallet stock, and the fresh sawdust piled up pale and sweet under the head saw all day long. Now here is what you need to understand about a mill like that. A mill is a place that runs on what it can sell, and it does not have much patience for anything it cannot. Behind the shed there stood a burner, a great rusted cone of iron, and into it went everything the mill could not turn into money. Slab wood, bark, split ends, the crooked pieces, the short pieces, the knotty pieces. All day the men fed the burner, and all day it roared and smoked, and nobody thought a thing about it. That was just how a mill worked. You cut the good long boards, and you burned the rest so it did not pile up and get in your way. And every so often, mixed in with the oak, a load of cedar would come through. Eastern red cedar, the folks down there called it, though it is really a kind of juniper. The trees that grow up scrubby and twisted along the rocky glades and old fence lines all over the Ozarks. When a cedar log hit the saw, the whole yard would go sweet with the smell of it. That clean, sharp fragrance you know from a hope chest or a pencil box. But cedar out of the glades grows short and knotty and full of turns, and a mill that wants long, straight boards has no use for most of it. So the good, clear middle got sawn, and every crooked offcut, every knot-riddled end, every short, ruddy scrap went the same place all the rest of the waste went, straight onto the slash pile and straight into the fire. Day after day, that fragrant wood burned. The men would toss an armload of cedar ends into the burner and never look twice, and the smell of it would ride out over the hollow. And that was the end of it. Worthless, everybody agreed. Too short to saw, too knotty to plane, too much trouble to fool with. Firewood, if you were feeling generous. Trash, if you were being honest. But there was one man who looked at that pile differently. His name was Silas Ballew, and he was 71 years old that fall. He was a widower, had been for 9 years, and he lived alone in a little frame house with a shed out back, about 2 miles from the mill. Silas was one of those quiet old men that a town half forgets is even there. He had spent his life fixing things. He caned chairs and mended broken furniture. He sharpened saws and set axe handles. He could put a new bottom on a bucket or a new leg on a table. And he did it all in that shed of his, slow and careful, for whatever a body could pay. He never raised his voice. He never had much to say. Folks liked him fine and thought about him rarely, the way you think about a good fence post, which is to say you only notice it when it is gone. And Silas Ballew had a habit of coming by the mill. He would buy a little clear oak now and again for his repair work, and sometimes he just came to watch, standing off to the side with his hands in the pockets of his old canvas coat. What nobody knew was that for weeks that fall, Silas had been watching the cedar burn. He would stand there while the men fed those short ruddy scraps into the fire, and something in him would tighten up, the way it does when you watch a thing go to waste that you know in your bones does not have to. So one cold morning, Silas walked across the yard to where Dale Hutchens stood. Hutchens was the man who ran the mill, a big square-shouldered fellow in his 50s. Not a cruel man, but a busy one, the kind who measured every hour by what it earned. Silas took off his hat, which was his way, and he said, "Dale, that cedar you all been burning, the scrap, would you let me haul it off?" Hutchens looked at him like he had asked to haul off a load of last week's rain. "The cedar scrap," he said. "Yes, sir. The short pieces, the knotty ends, what you throw in the burner." A couple of the yardmen had drifted over by then, and one of them, a young fellow named Rooney, laughed out loud. "Silas, that stuff ain't even good stove wood. It pops and throws sparks. What in the world you want with it?" Silas just turned his hat around in his hands and said, mild as milk, "I got a use for it." Hutchens shrugged, and you could see him doing the arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic came out simple. If the old man hauled the cedar scrap away, that was one less thing to burn, one less pile to tend, one less bit of trouble in a day already full of it. "Take all the trash you can carry, Silas," he said, and he was already turning back to his work. "You'd be saving me the burning. Take every stick of it." And that was that. The men laughed a little more, and Rooney said something about the old man building himself a bonfire, and they all went back to feeding oak into the saw. Nobody gave it a second thought. Why would they? A forgotten old man had asked to cart off the garbage, and the boss had said yes, and there was oak to cut, and money to make, and the burner to keep fed. But here's the part that matters, and I want you to hold on to it. Not one man in that yard, not Hutchens, not Rooney, not a single one of them, had the first idea what Silas Ballew saw when he looked at that heap. They saw firewood. He saw something else entirely. And by the time the dogwoods bloomed the next spring, every one of those men would find himself standing in that old man's shed, turning his hat in his hands the same way Silas had turned his, and not able to think of one single word to say. Now here is something worth knowing about the wood they were burning. Eastern red cedar is not a true cedar at all. It is a juniper, Juniperus virginiana, and it grows across nearly all of the eastern United States, thriving in the poor rocky ground and old pastures where finer trees will not bother. Its reddish heartwood carries an aromatic oil, the source of that sharp, clean smell. And that oil is exactly what makes it precious for chests and closets. But the tree grows slow and crooked, full of knots, and the boards come short. Mills chasing long clear lumber for ties and framing looked at those knotty scraps and saw only waste, and fed them to the fire without a second thought. So Silas Ballew went to work, and I want to tell you what that work actually looked like, because it was nothing quick and nothing easy. That first week, he backed his old Ford pickup up to the slash pile at the mill and loaded it by hand, one arm load at a time. Short cedar ends, knotty offcuts, split slabs still ruddy with heartwood, all of it dusted with the dirt and sawdust of the yard. He hauled load after load, 2 miles down the county road to his place, and stacked it under the long eave of his shed to keep the weather off. Rooney and the other yardmen watched him come and go, and they shook their heads and grinned. An old man carting home firewood the mill was glad to be rid of. There was a joke in it somewhere, and they made it more than once. Now here is the thing about that cedar. It came to him rough. Every piece was a problem. A short scrap might have 3 loose knots in it, and a twist you could see down its length. The pale sapwood, which has none of the fragrance and none of the worth, clung along the edges of the red heartwood and had to be cut away. Some pieces were checked and split from lying out in the weather. A man who wanted a shortcut would have looked at that pile and quit on the spot. But Silas did not want a shortcut. All that winter, through the short cold days and the long cold nights, he stood at his bench and he sorted. He learned that wood the way you learn a person, slowly and by paying attention. He learned to read each scrap and see the good clean heartwood hiding inside the rough of it. He cut out the loose knots and set the tight sound ones where they would show as a dark swirl in the grain, because a cedar knot, left where it belongs, is not a flaw. It is the very thing that makes the wood beautiful. He planed the rough offcuts down, stroke after stroke, until the dull gray weathered surface curled away, and the wood underneath came up warm and red and breathing that clean, sharp smell, and his whole shed filled with it until you could smell cedar from the road. And then came the hard part, the part that separated Silas Ballew from every other man who ever looked at that pile. The pieces were short. You cannot build much of anything out of scraps a foot or two long unless you can join them, edge to edge and end to end, so seamlessly that the joins hold for a lifetime and hardly show at all. So Silas taught himself to cut dovetails by hand. If you have never watched it done, a dovetail joint is a thing of real beauty and real patience. You cut a row of angled pins on the end of one board and a row of matching tails on the end of the other, each one by hand with a fine saw and a sharp chisel. And when they are cut true, they slide together and lock like fingers folded tight. No nail, no screw, nothing but the shape of the wood holding the wood. It is the mark of good work. It is the joint the finest chests and drawers have been built on for hundreds of years. And it is slow, exacting, unforgiving work. The kind where one careless cut ruins a piece you spent an hour bringing to true. Silas cut them by lamplight long after dark, his old hands steady on the saw. He would cut and fit and pare and fit again. And when a joint finally slid home tight and clean, he would set it down and just look at it for a while. He was building something, and it was not firewood. What he was building were chests. Cedar hope chests. The kind a family keeps at the foot of a bed, lined solid on the inside with that fragrant red heartwood. The kind of chest a mother fills with quilts and linens for a daughter's wedding day. Because here is the plain reason cedar is worth anything at all. That aromatic oil in the heartwood, the very oil that made the whole yard sweet when it burned, keeps the moths and the insects out of wool and cloth. A cedar chest is not just a box. It is a box that protects what you put in it, and folks have prized them for exactly that, going back longer than anyone can rightly say. The mill had been burning, load after load, the raw material of the one thing cedar does better than any wood in the country. But nobody saw that yet. Nobody except Silas. His neighbors surely did not see it. Word got around the way it does in a hill town that old Ballew was spending the whole winter fooling with mill scraps out in his shed, and folks made of it about what you would expect. "He's burning good lamp oil to make furniture out of trash," one man said down at the feed store. "You can't build nothing out of stove wood," said another. A few of the millmen, when they saw him at the store, would ask him with a straight face how the firewood business was coming along, and then grin at each other when he had gone. Even his own daughter worried over it. Her name was Ruth, and she lived over near Birch Tree with her husband, and she would come by on a Sunday and find her father out in the cold shed with cedar shavings to his ankles, and a lamp burning, and his supper gone cold on the stove. "Daddy," she said to him one evening, and there was real fret in her voice, "you're spending your pension money on glue and hinges and lamp oil for something the whole town is laughing at. Winter's no time to be out here freezing over a pile of scraps. What are you going to have to show for it?" Silas set down his chisel and looked at his daughter for a long moment. He was not a man who argued. He had never in his life tried to talk anybody into anything. And so all he said, in that mild, soft voice of his, was this: "Ruthie, the wood will speak for itself. Give it till spring." And that was all. He did not tell her what he saw. He could not have, really. Not in a way that would have made sense to anyone who had not stood where he stood and looked at that pile and seen it. Some things you cannot argue. You can only build them and set them down where the light hits, and let folks look for themselves. So Ruth went home worried, and the town kept up its joke, and the mill kept up its work. And out in a cold shed 2 miles down the county road, an old man kept his lamp burning long past midnight, cutting dovetails one careful stroke at a time, while the smell of cedar poured out under the door and into the dark. Here is something worth understanding about why a cedar chest works. The fragrance you smell is a volatile oil in the heartwood, and while people have long believed that scent alone drives moths away, the real protection is more particular. A tightly built cedar chest, with joints snug enough to seal, keeps out the adult clothes moths that lay the eggs, and the aromatic compounds can kill the young larvae that do the actual damage to wool. That is why the joinery mattered so much. A loose box full of gaps is just a box. It is the tight seam, the true dovetail, that turns fragrant wood into real protection. And Silas knew it. And this is the part where everything changed. By the time the first warm days came to the Ozarks the next spring, when the dogwoods went white along the ridges and the redbuds came out that soft purple-pink up the hollows, Silas Ballew finished his first chests. There were 3 of them done, and I wish you could have seen them. He had sanded them until the wood was smooth as river glass, and rubbed them out with oil until the grain came alive, and the red heartwood glowed warm and deep with those dark cedar knots swirling through it like weather in a sky. The dovetails at every corner locked together so tight and true you had to look twice to find the seam. And when you lifted a lid, the smell that came up at you was the whole spring in one breath. Clean and sharp and sweet. His shed did not smell like a shed anymore. It smelled like something you would want to keep. Now Silas was not a man to go around telling folks he had done a fine thing. He never had been. So he did the only thing that made sense to him. He wrestled one of those chests up into the bed of his old Ford, wrapped in a quilt so it would not get marked, and he drove it into town to see what it might be worth to anybody. He stopped first at the general store in Mountain View, and he asked the fellow who ran it if he could set the chest inside by the front window, just to see. And here is what happened, and it happened fast. A woman came in for thread and stopped dead when she saw it. Then a man came in for feed and forgot what he came for. Within the hour, there was a little knot of people gathered around that chest, and they were not laughing. They were running their hands over the smooth lid. They were bending down to look close at the corners, at those tight hand-cut dovetails, and you would hear one of them say low, "Would you look at that joint? There's not a nail in the whole thing." They were lifting the lid and leaning in and breathing the cedar and going quiet. The particular kind of quiet that comes over people when they are looking at something made well by a pair of patient hands. The storekeeper watched all this, and then he watched Silas standing off to the side with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Silas, where in the world did you get the wood for this?" And Silas said, mild as ever, "Off the burn pile out at Dale Hutchens' mill. It's the cedar they've been throwing in the fire." You could have heard a pin drop in that store. From there, the word ran ahead of him like water downhill. Silas took the chest on over to West Plains, 30-some miles south, where a man ran a furniture and dry goods store, a fellow who knew good work when it came in his door. That dealer walked all the way around the chest twice. He opened it and closed it. He tipped it and looked underneath at how it was joined. And then he named a price, a real price, more money than Silas had seen in one piece in a good long while. And he said, "How many more of these can you make me, Mr. Ballew? Because I can sell every one you bring." And before Silas had even settled that in his mind, a woman who had come in behind him, a mother whose girl was to be married in the fall, put her hand on the lid and said she wanted one just like it, and would he please make it in time for the wedding. Silas Ballew drove home that evening with an empty truck bed and more orders than he had fingers to count them on. And I expect the hills never looked prettier to him than they did on that drive. But the part I most want you to see is what happened back at the mill. Word travels in a hill country, and it did not take long for it to travel back up the gravel cut to Dale Hutchens. At first, he did not believe it. Somebody told him old Ballew was selling cedar chests down in West Plains for real money, chests built out of the mill's own burn pile. And Hutchens laughed and said that was the tallest tale he had heard all year. But it kept coming back to him, from too many folks to shrug off, until finally one afternoon he got in his own truck and drove the 2 miles down to Silas Ballew's place to see the thing with his own eyes. He was not alone. Rooney came, and 2 or 3 of the other yardmen came, the same men who had laughed at the old man loading his firewood all fall. They came half expecting a joke, I think, ready to grin about it on the drive home. They did not grin. Silas met them at the shed door and let them in without a word, and they filed inside. And there they stopped, because there in the lamplight stood the chests, 2 finished, and a third half built on the bench, and the whole place was thick with that clean cedar smell, and the wood glowed red and warm on every side. Hutchens walked up to the nearest chest slow, the way a man walks up to something he is not sure he is allowed to touch. He put his big square hand on the lid. He bent down and looked at the dovetails, one corner and then the next. And he ran his thumb along a seam so tight it would not catch a fingernail. He lifted the lid and the smell came up, and he stood there breathing it. And for a long, long moment, Dale Hutchens did not say one single word. Because he knew that wood. He knew every knot and every ruddy grain of it. It was the wood he had been feeding to the fire, load after load, day after day, for more years than he wanted to think about. Right there under his hand was the proof of what he had been burning, made into something so fine he could hardly believe a man's hands had done it, and he could not find a thing in the whole world to say. Rooney was the one who finally spoke, and all he could manage was, "Quiet. Silas, this come off the burn pile?" And Silas just nodded and set another dovetail into place, and the joint slid home tight and clean. Here is something worth knowing, now that the wood has spoken for itself. There is nothing rare about eastern red cedar. It grows all over, cheap and common, so common that mills for generations treated the scrap as trash and let it burn. What was rare was never the wood. What was rare was a man who knew what the wood could do and had the patience to do it. The same cedar sat in front of everyone at that mill for years, and its worth stayed hidden, not because it was not there, but because no one had the eyes to see it or the hands to bring it out. Value, it turns out, is not only in the thing, it is in the knowing. Now let me tell you how it all came out, because the turning of a thing is one story, and what a man does after he has been proven right is another one entirely, and it is usually the truer of the two. That spring, and on into the summer of 1960, the orders never let up. Word had gotten clear across Howell County and beyond, and folks drove in from West Plains and Willow Springs, and up from the Arkansas line to stand in Silas Ballew's fragrant shed and put their name down for a cedar chest. A bride wanted one for her linens. A farmer wanted one for his wife because her mother had had one once, and it had burned in a house fire, and he had never forgotten how she cried over it. The furniture man down in West Plains took every chest Silas could carry him and asked for more. An old forgotten man who fixed chairs for whatever a body could pay had, in a single winter, become the one craftsman in that whole stretch of the Ozarks that everyone wanted to see. And out at the mill, something had shifted for good. Dale Hutchens could not stop thinking about it. He would stand by that burner of an afternoon, watching the fire take the day's slab and scrap, and every time a piece of cedar went in, he would feel it like a small cut. He had done the arithmetic his whole life, measured every hour by what it earned, and now the arithmetic had turned around on him and shown him something he did not want to see. For years, he had been paying men to carry a fortune to the fire, so Hutchens gave an order at the mill that surprised everybody who heard it. The cedar scrap was not to be burned anymore. It was to be pulled off the line and stacked clean and dry under the shed roof, every short, knotty, ruddy piece of it, and set aside. Then he drove down to Silas Ballew's place a second time, and this time he came alone, and he came with his hat in his hand. "Silas," he said, and it cost him something to say it. You could tell. "I've been burning that cedar for the better part of 20 years. I want you to have it. All of it. Whatever comes through the mill. We'll haul it to you ourselves. I'll charge you fair, and not a penny more. And I'll count myself lucky you don't charge me for being a fool about it this long." And so all that summer, the millmen, the very ones who had laughed, hauled cedar down the county road to the old man's shed and stacked it under his eave. And there was no joke in it now. Rooney took to lingering after he unloaded, watching Silas work. And one day he asked, shy about it, if the old man might show him how a dovetail was cut. And Silas, who had never in his life turned away a soul who wanted to learn something honest, cleared a space at the bench and put a saw in the young man's hand and started him on it. Slow, one careful stroke at a time. The way you learn a thing that is worth knowing. Here is what I most want you to understand about Silas Ballew. Through all of it, he never changed. He did not crow. He did not lord it over the men who had laughed, and he did not once say, "I told you so," though he had surely earned the right. He kept the same steady hours he had always kept. He kept the same soft voice. He fixed a chair now and again for a neighbor, just as before, for whatever they could pay, because that was who he was, and being right about the cedar did not make him somebody else. The money was welcome, and he was grateful for it, but it was never the thing. The thing was always the wood, and the work, and the quiet joy of taking what was thrown away and making it into something that would outlast him. The mill that had burned that cedar for 20 years could hardly believe, even then, what it had thrown into the fire all that time. And a heap of scrap wood that a whole town had called worthless had become, in one old man's patient hands, the pride of that corner of Missouri. His daughter Ruth came by one Sunday late that summer, and she stood in the doorway of the shed and watched her father work in the cedar light. And she thought about the winter she had fretted over him freezing out here over a pile of trash. She said, soft, "Daddy, you were right, about all of it." The wood did speak for itself, and she asked him the thing that everybody in the county had been wondering all along. She asked him how he had known, how he had looked at that burned pile, when every other soul who ever passed it saw only firewood and seen chests. Silas set down his chisel. He was quiet a while, the way he always was before he said anything that mattered. And then he told her, in his own plain words, the only lesson he ever spoke out loud in the whole of this story. "Ruthie," he said, "there's mighty little in this world that's truly worthless. There's just things folks haven't learned to see yet. That cedar was always worth something, every stick of it, from the first day it came off the saw. The only thing that ever changed was that somebody finally stopped and looked. Waste isn't a thing that's in the wood. It's a thing that's in the eye. You throw away what you don't understand, and you keep what you do. And most of the sorrow in a life comes from getting those two backwards. I just looked a little longer than the rest is all. Anybody could have. I only wish more folks would." That was all he said. He was not a man for speeches, and he never made another one. He picked his chisel back up and went on cutting, and the sweet smell of the cedar filled the shed, and Ruth stood in the door with her eyes wet, and did not trust herself to speak. Silas Ballew went on making his chests for 11 more years, until his hands finally gave out on him, and there are homes all through those Ozark hills to this day with a cedar chest at the foot of a bed that the old man built out of wood a mill was going to burn. But if you had gone into his little frame house in any of those years, and looked at the windowsill above his kitchen sink, you would have seen a small thing there, and it is where I will leave you. It was a little cedar box, no bigger than your two hands cupped together, with a lid that fit so snug its side when you closed it. It was the very first thing Silas ever made, back at the start, from a single scrap he had carried home in his coat pocket that first cold morning, just to see what was in it. He never sold it. He never meant to. Its lid had gone smooth and soft as skin from all the years of his thumb rubbing across it, and the red had mellowed to a deep old gold. And if you had lifted that little lid, even after all that time, the smell that came up to meet you would have been clean and sharp and sweet, and every bit as alive as the morning he first planned it out of a piece of wood that everybody but him had thrown away. Here is a last thing worth knowing. The story of that cedar is an old American story, and it keeps happening. Materials the world throws away get looked at again by somebody with patient hands and better eyes, and turn out to have been treasure the whole time. Sawdust becomes fuel, scrap iron becomes tools, and cedar the mills once burned now lines closets and chests in half the country. The lesson holds far past the wood. What we call waste is very often only a failure to see, and the fortune is usually sitting right there in the pile, waiting on the one person willing to stop and look.